Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 487 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Haakon Lenzi. A lifelong New Yorker, Haakon makes slipware pots from his studio in East Harlem. In our interview, we talk about marbleizing slip on the surface of pots, sustaining a studio in the city, and the value of community building through sales and tours. Haakon has participated in the Hudson Valley Pottery Tour since its beginning, and you can find him this weekend, October the 21st and 22nd, as a guest of Doug Peltzman for the 7th annual tour. If you'd like to find out more about that, you can visit HudsonValleyPotteryTour.com. I'm excited to be heading north this weekend to be a part of the New Clay Conference in Ottawa, Ontario. I'll be co-hosting a live taping of this podcast with Carole and Marianne Chenard from the Kiln Sitters this Friday, October the 20th. I'll also be demonstrating all weekend, and I'll have pots for sale, so if you want to come on out and say hello, I'd love to see you there. I'm going to be demonstrating with Martina Lanton, Marina Lopez, and Zoe Pinnell, so it's going to be a great weekend of talking shop and making pots. You can find out more about that by following New Clay Conference on Instagram. You can also buy tickets at gloucesterpotteryschool.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about New York City. There's not a lot of New York City, I should say, there are a lot of New York City potters, but it is hard to be a New York City potter. So can you talk about growing up in the city and then deciding, like, I'm going to stay in the city to make my living?
Yes. I mean, it's interesting now because there is so much ceramics in the city. And, there are a lot of potters, and it's a really interesting time to be here. But I am a lifelong New Yorker. I was born here, grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. And, listen, I love New York. If you had told me that New York would be uh, even less wild than it was in the early 2000s, because I was growing up, everyone was like from the 70s and 80s. So they had these crazy stories. And now looking back, it's like, oh, yeah, it was like kind of a little bit of wild, wild west. Like Soho was just like no man's land, and you could do whatever you wanted down there. That's totally not what you asked, but what brought me to do pottery and stay here in New York City? I did my undergrad, and I graduated sort of right after the recession. I never had any intention of moving back to New York. I actually I had this moment as a teenager where I went and saw BB King at it's gone now, but he had a venue called BB King's in Times Square, and it was amazing. I mean, he was such a legend, and he told like stories about history of America. It was so cool. And I got out, and I really thought that it was still daytime, and then I looked at the sky, and I realized it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I was like, oh man, like this is not natural. I shouldn't be living here. And that was right around the time I got into doing pottery, and was like, okay, I'm going to become a potter. I'll probably like move to some mountain, hilltop, whatever, secluded, set up my atmospheric kiln and do that whole thing. And really, honestly, even at the time of me graduating college, that's kind of where I saw myself going. And my father, who I'm very close with, and is a huge influence on me as an artist in a lot of ways. He's a chef, and he opened up a restaurant in our neighborhood, like literally actually on the block that I grew up on. And, you know, just like a lot of other things, the wake of the financial crisis was a tough time to be in business or be anybody. And he really needed my help. So initially he asked me, like, will you come and work with me? I just need someone in my corner. And I said yes, because, dutiful son, I don't know, first generation immigrant stuff, whatever. Um, and then 1 year turned into 2 years. But in the middle of that, in the beginning, maybe actually in the beginning of that, and this is really why I'm here, is that I met my wife, Sophie Fader. And she, I mean, uh, I'll tell you our meet cute story. I went out to get a Gatorade for me and the other bartender because we both worked doubles that day. And I came in, and she was at the end of the bar, and we had seen each other in the neighborhood. She was renting a place above the bar, and we started talking about things like Italo Calvino. Very quickly, I found out that she had a copy of Val Cushing's handbook, and I said to myself right there, because she had done ceramics in high school, and her high school teacher, who actually you might know, Keith Renner, who's married to Brenda Quinn.
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Brenda.
Brenda.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean they're amazing, both of them. And she's an amazing ceramist. She's local here too. She lives in I guess in Westchester. Anyway, yeah, she told me she had this copy of the Val Cushing book, and I was like, okay, I have to marry this woman. This is not something that comes around that often. And she was committed to being here. And then very quickly I realized, look, I mean, being a New Yorker is a huge part of my identity, my personality. I'm also an only child, and have family obligations. And her family is all, I mean, there actually are all over the place, but her immediate family is all in the city. So here we are, and that was 13 years ago. And I have my studio and a kiln, and live in some version of the dream.
Well, let's talk food, because if your dad is a chef, I'm sure you've grown up experiencing a lot of different types of food. What is the food that he cooks, and then what are your favorite foods in New York City?
Yes, great question. So first of all, I mean, I would be lying if I said, and I don't want to make my situation sound more dire than it was, but it was a little bit of the shoemaker's kid never has shoes story, in that people always think like, oh, your dad's a chef, he must cook all the time. And growing up, my dad worked 14-hour days. That's the life of a chef. And then when he was off, he really didn't want to cook. So what did we do? We ate a lot of pizza. We went to Chinatown a lot. I love Chinatown. One of my earliest memories is being in a Chinese restaurant and my dad saying, listen, this is Chinese ravioli and Chinese spaghetti. You're going to love it. And it was like the best thing in the world to me. Growing up, like later on as an adult, it's actually been the opposite. Now my father is retired, and he loves to cook food for us. I mean, it's amazing. He's Italian, Italian American, so he likes to make a lot of food. And similar, to us as potters, like I can't just make one cup. I need to make a lot of pots when you get into it. And so it's the same thing with cooking. He can't just make like a quart of soup. Um, what's his background? He was a classically trained French chef, and in a different world, also specialized in something that is not around anymore called continental cuisine, but was always influenced by, really sort of like world cooking, like the traditions of all places, sort of an early adapter to that kind of thing. I think the only thing he never really tried to cook, except for a couple of times, was Asian food. But he loves like Eastern European food, goulashes, and that sort of thing. And of course, he makes a lot of Italian food. Really, what's his favorite thing to make? I would say would be whatever he's inspired by in the moment. So the other summer, my wife and I went to Italy, and we, sent him a picture of some rabbit that we ate. So, what did he do? He went to a live poultry place and got some rabbits, and because actually there are a lot of there's a lot of live poultry stuff in New York City. Part of it's for like halal community, and then also Mexican Americans. And I live in East Harlem, which is sort of like also known as like Little Mexico or Spanish Harlem. Anyway, so yeah, of course he made rabbit, and it's like you feel like you're eating for like a medieval king. It's pretty amazing. Um,
Well, I'm very interested in how people's parents jobs affect them. And I think with cooking, there's this idea that like that might look weird, but if it tastes good, it doesn't matter. Like it's good, like the aesthetics of it. I guess it depends on if you're in a fancy restaurant, but for the most part, the aesthetics don't matter if the taste is good. And I think that's an interesting thing about pots. Like you can have a really good pot that might not fit someone's aesthetic, but if it is made well, it feels well, if the elements of craft are there, it's still a good pot. And I think there's something about living in a cosmopolitan area where, at least when me, who didn't grow up in an environment like that, when I went to New York City the first time, I saw lots of things that confused me, but I could tell were good.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you talk about this idea of discernment, like how you learn that either from your father or in your own studies of clay or music or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really perceptive and interesting question. I mean, immediately I think of that sort of famous Pete Pennell video of him talking about cups, which I'm sure maybe some of your viewers have listened to. If you haven't, just Google Pete Pennell cups, and it's an amazing talk. Um, but the first thing I thought of when you asked me that was that the inverse can also be true, right? Many things that look very good don't taste good. And that's a weird phenomenon of social media, cooking, especially like I think I'm not really one to use recipes very often. I kind of like really just go by vibes when I'm cooking and taste things a lot as I cook. But I think we've all had that experience of like, wow, look at this thing. And you get that New York Times recipe and then you make it and it looks great. And it's just like, wow, gross. And I think, my father certainly had a big, everything he makes is beautiful looking, I think. But a lot of it, I think, is certainly cultural. Like, if you're not used to eating squid or eating tripe, which, if your listeners don't know, is, intestine. I mean, that's like gross and scary. But then actually, it's really delicious. And now, when I see tripe on a menu, I mean, I perk up. I'm quite excited. So a lot of that is cultural, and then you can also have, and I think this is something we have a lot of, especially with the internet, is like you have the pot that looks really good, but maybe it weighs 1,000,000 pounds, or it just feels really awful to hold, or like it dribbles down the side of your mouth or whatever. So I guess like all things in life, it's like trying to find that balance of making things look aesthetic, because people experience things in such a multitude of ways. No one just experiences the world visually or auditorially, or senses are a wide spectrum. So you have to find that balance between looking good and feeling good, I guess, right?
I had a friend that used to say that all the time. I'd say, "How are you doing?" He'd say, "Looking good, feeling good."
Well, that's from Trading Places.
Is it? Okay.
Yes, yeah. It's like a famous Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy movie from the 1980s.
Yeah. Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I use that line all the time. It's like a big one in my mind. Yeah, lives rent free, as they would say, in my mind.
Well, let's talk about coming back from the period in which you came back from undergrad, and then you're in the kitchen or you're in the restaurant, you're having that experience, you meet your wife, and then how did you decide to stay in East Harlem? Like, is that that's your neighborhood? You grew up there, so you're staying there, or did you settle there for a specific purpose?
That's a great question. So no, I did not grow up in East Harlem. I do have a connection to this neighborhood because one of the oldest pizzerias in the world, I mean, not in the world, in the United States, are debatably the first in the United States. It's not clear who's the first, which is called it's the original Patsy's Pizza. Anyway, that's here in East Harlem. So I used to ride my bike over here all the time and get pizza as a kid. And you got to keep in mind, like when I was like 14, like I had like a mohawk and stuff. And like these guys just opened their arms up for me. Like they were so excited every time I came. And it was like the old maitre d', his name was Danny. He would be like, "Listen, Hawk, like I'm not gonna lie, I don't want you to eat the pizza today." I'm like, "What's wrong?" He goes, "We ran out of sauce, so we had to go buy some sauce." And someone comes in, a tourist, I'll give it to him, but you know what this is about, and we're just not gonna do it. Just come back, I'll give you a free slice next time. Anyway, that was sort of my initial connection to the neighborhood. I grew up on the Upper West Side. I had sort of like, in a way, a little bit of a West Side Story childhood in that, my mom lived in a very posh neighborhood 63rd and Central Park West, which I think even if you're not that familiar with New York City, you know that that's a kind of a fancy neighborhood. Or maybe you don't. But anyway, so that's where my mom lived, and then my dad lived all the way in West Harlem, up on 119th in Amsterdam. And both of those areas were really different when I was growing up. Like Central Park West was very fancy, but like the surrounding Columbus Circle areas were like very gritty, and that was super fun to hang out in and grow up in. And the area that I'm from in West Harlem, maybe you would call, some people would call it Morningside Heights, was actually like a sort of sleepier kind of area. I knew all my neighbors and that sort of thing, and that's where my dad was when I got out of school, and so I was living there, and basically. The bar restaurant was on the corner of our block. It was a location that had been empty my entire childhood, and we would wait for the bus. My dad would be like, "One day I'm gonna have a restaurant in this place," and so I would go like whole months without even going below 110th Street, and I just became very committed to the community of Harlem. I'm the kind of person where if I walk around in a lot of Harlem, people know me. They say hi. And New York is like a funny small town in that way. Back to your initial question of what brought me to stay in Harlem and how did I sort of get my career going again, I guess. I did not make work, honestly, for almost the first year that I after graduation. And I also have to just, be clear of like what allowed me to do all of this stuff I'm about to say is that I was able to graduate from school with very little debt. I went to Alfred University, which is actually the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. And so it was a public school, which meant that my tuition was very low compared to many other places, obviously. And also I had like very generous scholarship for at least the first few years. So I did eventually have to take some money out, but it made my loans pretty manageable. And living on my dad's couch that year, I don't brag. I don't like to brag about this because I have so many friends who are in crippling debt. But I was really able to pay off my loans within the first sort of year and a half.
Wow.
So I'm so lucky, and that has just given me like a freedom. And I was very aware of that at the time. I understood that. And a lot of it, first of all, again, back to my dad, he really was like, listen, if you go to a private college, like this money, like you're going to have to pay it back and it's going to be difficult. So that was, really good advice on his part. But I also, how do I say this? Seeing my peers, once the loan bills came back in just after a few months after school, I was like, okay, I am very fortunate to be in this situation. And use it or lose it, smoke them if you got them kind of attitude. Like I'm in a position to sort of make this happen. And so many fortuitous things happened to me in that period. And basically a person came into the bar on a sort of slow day, and a common question that people ask a bartender, especially in New York City, is, what's your other thing? And I was like, well, my other thing is, I did graduate with a BFA. I have like a pretty serious ceramics practice, but I'm not doing it. I had like rented a little studio space in Brooklyn for several months. And, my professor, Andrea Gill, told me before the school ended, she was like, look, you can work full time for your dad and you can rent a studio somewhere and you can try doing both of those things. And you'll do it for several months, and then you get really sick and you're going to have to give something up. And she was 100% right. So I sort of took a break from ceramics. And anyway, fortuitously, this woman was like, well, do you know about the Teachers College ceramics program? And just for context for your listeners who aren't familiar with New York City, 119th in Amsterdam, I was directly across the street from Columbia University, and Teachers College is its own university, but is also affiliated with Columbia University. And that's on 121st Street. And keep in mind, I grew up there. I did ceramics in high school. I had never heard of it before. And she was like, listen, let me you seem like a really interesting guy. You have a really interesting background and perspective. Let me send an email right now to the director of the department, whose name is Tom Lawler, and introduce you guys. And I had a blog at the time, so she sent my blog. And Tom was very encouraging, invited me to come into the studio. And honestly, I mean, that meeting with Tom Lawler, who is the director of the ceramics department at Teachers College, was very fortuitous and set up sort of the rest of my life of being here in a way. I think, like a lot of other people who do their undergrad in ceramics, I had kind of assumed I would do this sort of typical route. I would do some residencies, then I would go to graduate school, and then I would probably try and get like an academic job. And I did some of those things in some ways, but meeting Tom, he was like, I don't know how to say this, like my patron saint in a way. Like you couldn't imagine someone who had more specialized information in the things you were interested in. It was like such a blessing to meet this guy. And for those, and he's a great person to actually have on your podcast. He's a really interesting guy who can tell amazing stories. If your listeners aren't familiar with him, he was the director of the Lincoln Center Foundation for the Arts for over 25 years, and has been a professional sculptor and ceramist and done commissions all around the world. And his work is deeply rooted in antiquity and engages with the history of cities. So Tom is, he's from Michigan, is where he grew up, but he's been in New York since the 70s. So of course he has like a lot of amazing stories. And a lot of his work really focused on New York being a sort of special place, and him being there at a special time. And his studies he has this thesis that places can be very special, and that that the quality that makes them special is when many different people from different places come together, and there are all these material factors that shape that, not all of them good, but there are interesting things that can come out of cities. And so the other relationship that he's always had is with ancient Rome. Funny, given the whole social media thing of how many times a day do guys think about ancient Rome. I mean, I think Tom thinks about ancient Rome a lot, probably. And so, very much of his work is sort of engaged with comparing the two in a way, and finding similarities and finding similarities in terms of how cities shape people and the output that they have. And I'm deeply interested in ceramic history. I mean, I think that was sort of like, for a lot of people, that was the thing that really drew me into the field as a teenager. I always loved history, and ceramics is such a good way to explore that. It's kind of unavoidable. And meeting Tom, I was like, okay, well, this is my graduate school. And so basically, I signed up for an independent study with him. And, I worked it out with my dad that my night off would be Tuesday night. So at 6:30, I would take my work hat off, and I would walk across the street, and I would throw pots and sort of, we read books and this is also, it's Teachers College. So half of the students are either in the arts education program, which is very good, or they are in the broader Columbia University program. So we had a lot of neurology students and stuff like that. And then the rest of the students are community ceramics people just from the community. So it really was such an interesting mix of people. And, I had one of my peers was a Yoruban priestess, and had been in Nigeria shortly after the revolution and stuff like that, working for the Peace Corps. So what a privilege it was to get to know people like that. And then also friends who were studying neurology and arts education. So it was a very rich culture there. And then Tom and also my wife and eventually my father encouraged me after a few years to slowly step down from working in the restaurant to pursue ceramics more full time. And I sort of I spent the year building up, not a year, but I spent several months building up a portfolio, which is kind of funny if you think about it. Like, to take just several months. But I had all these ideas, and it was amazing. It was an amazing time for my work. And I applied to a whole bunch of residencies, and I got into none of them. And it was only moderately discouraging. And then just by chance on Facebook, I saw a Facebook post for Greenwich House Pottery that they were looking for a studio technician, and I applied for the job. I got it, and that was in 2014. So this is sort of 4-year arc. And once that happened, it was like, okay, this is my life here. I'm committed to this place, and I moved in with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, and she was living on 148th Street at the time, and so it just was very clear that this was the place that we were going to spend our lives. And every year after, that's only reaffirmed that, especially living here through the pandemic lockdown period. My commitment to New York, we never even considered leaving for a moment, although there were friends who generously offered to take us in and stuff like that. So, I'm pretty committed to this place.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Can you talk about the evolution of your work in terms of your exploration of color? So there's times in which glaze has been a big part of color, and then, now it's slip and glaze. So can you talk about like your interest in color and how you've gotten that in the ceramic form?
Yes. So for your listeners who might not be familiar with my work, I mainly work in slipware, marbleized slip, and I also have an agateware body of work that I make. And I kind of ping pong back and forth between them. And then I also have like other bodies of work. I have a splatterware, I call it splatterware body of work. And I would say, in terms of the evolution of color, starting back in my undergrad, I was an atmospheric potter. I went to Alfred because I wanted to actually be a wood fire potter. I did like a wood firing at Peters Valley right at the end of high school with Bruce Denhert and Todd Piker. And that was like, what an irresistible experience it was. Those guys were so amazing. Like, what incredible role models to have, and inspiring. And so I was like, wow, I have to do this. Like, I want to be just like these guys. And I actually had no sense of color. I wore brown all the time growing up, which is really funny. And then, I had to take color theory, and I got really into color and printmaking and that sort of thing. And it was just at a time where, ceramics was really transitioning from brown town to pop colors. Mason stains and stuff like that were very, very available. And there was sort of another thing that happened was I was very lucky in that I got like a scholarship to go to Aramont. And I took a workshop, this is while I was in college, with Victoria Christian, who, is such an amazing potter. And she was really like the first person to like have like a hot red slip. Like, I don't know what I guess you could say other people did it, but she was really like the pioneer of that. And so we started working in colored slips, and I came back to school and I was like, oh, this is the ticket. I love this. And then, I spent when I left school, obviously there's no soda kilns and stuff like that in New York. So in a way, I've always been trying to get back to that quality, which is challenging. And I found painting with colored slips to be a way that there's so much depth to painting with slip, and the final result in terms of transparency, what it's actually going to look like, is always a little bit of a surprise. So that was something I really went after. And even though my work has gone through all of these permutations, I would say like the first maybe 7 years after school, I probably made a whole new body of work every year. Maybe it was just like commitment issues in a way. Like I would get to a point where it was like, okay, but like, where's this work going to go now? Like I've kind of flushed it out. And now I'm in a place where, I think between these two things, it feels like I could explore them for the rest of my life. And it's interesting that you asked me about the color question, because in a big way, the last sort of several years, like color has kind of left my work. I've worked almost primarily in black and white. Why? I don't really know. Partly just in that it was getting to be like really overwhelming looking at all these colorful pots. I think actually starting to do more sales, like in-person sales, like what looks good in an image on a website gallery is really different than what looks good on a giant table or in a huge collection. And I mean, I just sort of like, I remember, doing the very first Hudson Valley pottery tour, looking at my work, I was like, wow, I love this work, but it does look like someone like shot up a clown. It was just like so much red, so much blue, so much green, so much orange. And I just kind of like reflected on it. And I was like, I need to make some work that is a little more digestible. And that just sort of led me into this kind of black and white period. And then, in terms of my relationship to glaze, I think I've just always loved, since even before I did pottery, I just loved the older Chinese porcelains and the sort of cascading cobalt effect. And so I wanted to sort of bring that into the work because, for me, landscape is something that I see in the slipware a lot. I mean, we could talk about just sort of the imagery that I use and stuff like that.
When you do the black and white, sometimes you'll have a translucent color on top. So say the green, there's this like great interaction between that green, the translucency of the green, but the depth of the slip. And that play between the two is so good.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's really, that means a lot as someone who really respects your work. I really appreciate that. I would say a lot of what you're picking up on is, I mean, just sort of my now 7-year relationship to this process. And I would say, like, I always tell people that the first 2 years I spent learning how to draw with the slip, getting the slip to go where I want it. And then the next 2 years I spent forgetting how to draw, learning to bring back the marbling, learning to let things kind of happen a little bit. And then since then, however you do the math, maybe that's the last 4 years, I have really been trying to bring both of those things together. So really allowing like the richness of the marbling effect to happen while retaining some qualities of drawing. And I don't know that people even know when I'm drawing, and that's exactly what I want. Like, I really don't want to see actually my direct hand work in a way. And so, in terms of getting depth, I fired an electric kiln, and as you know, it can be challenging when you are, especially if you're not working with like matte glazes, to get a lot of depth out of electric kilns. And so one thing is that I've had to develop a lot of interesting firing methodologies, but also just actually learning how to use, I could grab a spray bottle that's right next to me, learning how to use these applicator bottles of a variety of ones that I use in a way to get a variety of different mark qualities, right? I think if you look at like what makes a good drawing, it's the diversity of marks. If everything is a one note Sharpie line, it just, it's often not that enticing to people. So a lot of it is actually just like things that I figured out by accident, like spraying slip when the bottle was just not full enough, and that creating a kind of misty background and applying the slip at a variety of times. Keep in mind, I can only slip something for maybe a minute tops. Everything happens really quickly. But if I apply the slip in the beginning of the minute towards the middle and the end, it's going to sit differently in the background. So different ways of forcing perspective. And then, of course, the green glaze was sort of as close as I could really get to a very transparent celadon, which is actually what I truly love. That's the celadon porcelains are sort of like my lifelong love affair in a way. You can make a very beautiful fake celadon in an electric kiln with robin's egg blue mason stain, but it's actually quite opaque because that's the quality of mason stain. So that's what got me to settle on this green. And then I used to be an earthenware potter for a long time. The beginning of this was all in earthenware, and then I was able to sort of recreate it as a high fire potter, which is an interesting thing to do, to try to recreate your work in low fire and high fire, which is sort of a funny direction.
Well, let's talk about hydration of clay, because I do slipware as a very simplified form of slipware. But what I know is that if I deflocculate the slip, that it hydrates the pot less, but it changes the way that slip that goes on top of that works. So am I right in thinking
Absolutely.
like you can't deflocculate your slip or that will change all the marbling, or do you deflocculate?
Yes, that's a really good point. I actually sometimes flocculate the slip a little bit. I do not deflocculate it because for the reason that you're talking about. Number one, if I deflocculate it, the slip is not going to move very well. And it stays wet for too long in a way. So often the pots will fall down more. That was my initial thing that I did because that's sort of, I think, the knee-jerk advice is deflocculate it so it has less water in there. But really, it ultimately, for me, it comes down to exactly what you're talking about. It comes down to the consistency of the clay at a given time and the consistency of the slip. So the clay in itself has to be wet enough that the slip can actually move for a little bit, but also things need to dry fast enough that it doesn't just turn into a vertical drip, which is something that I'm, of course it is present in my work, but I don't want it to be just a series of vertical drip lines. So
When you're applying the base level of slip, are you just dunking the pot in there?
you got it. Yeah, no, well, if it's a big pot, if it, like when I'm making a vase or something like that, yes, I will pour the slip, or if it's a platter or a bowl or something like that. But for the most part, yeah, I'm just dipping it in a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket of slip that I have. And then I have like literally old bus bins from the restaurant and applicator bottles ready to go. And I just sort of very quickly do it, and just really using gravity and intuition to move the slip around and create the patterns. And then there are like these little weird themes that I kind of slip in. Like I love the very traditional horsehair pattern. And if you look at like a lot of my bowls, I'm often trying to apply the slip in this sort of like what's that? Not Twinkies, but ho-ho kind of circular fashion. Trying to get that image there, and sometimes I retain some of it more than other times. But it really is very much the consistency of all those materials. And if I do too much to the slips, then it ends up becoming more of like having like a Jackson Pollock quality to it, where it's just sort of like these lines everywhere, which is cool. And actually was something I went after for a period, but is not where I'm at now.
Can you talk about the landscape idea? Like you mentioned that you're thinking about landscape, and I don't necessarily see. I've looked a lot at Chinese scroll paintings, and I think what I see in your work is the negative space in landscapes more than the drawing of the mountain or whatever it is. But can you talk about like your approach to that, what you see versus the spaces in between?
Yes. Well, I'll say, first of all, I'm Italian American and I'm also Norwegian. So if you're Norwegian, there is just like this unwritten law that you kind of need to paint dark landscapes at some point in your career. I mean, it's just is a thing. The landscape is like really overwhelming. And even though I haven't been there since I was a kid, it's a huge part of who I am. And my name is Haakon, that's how I say it, but it's really Haakon. So it's like one of the first things people find out about me. So anyway, that's part of where it's at. But in terms of like, thinking about landscape, I actually just said that because that's one of the things that I see in the work. In terms of what I'm actually putting out there, how do I say this? I'm actually making work that I think is more like a Rorschach test than a narrative abstraction. So, like the fact that you had that very perceptive insight, I mean, that is because, Ben, you are a person who has a deep understanding of Chinese porcelains and ceramic history. I mean, that's like a very deep perspective to share. And usually people come to me with very, very descriptive analyses of what they are experiencing in my pots. And I mean, most of the time I have no idea what they're talking about. And I love it. I love it so much because I think where I came from, for a long time, I made work that was very referential, still is obviously very referential to ceramic history, but it was a narrow group of people who could really relate to it. Like I did get to a point where there were some professional potters that I really respected that were giving me good feedback and like, wow, that's so cool. But, I think that a lot of it was just lost on the average consumer, whatever that means, who is the average pottery consumer. And that's also changed a lot in the last maybe eight or so years. But so I really wanted to create something where people could essentially create their own content and imbue that into the work. And a lot of that also was just like my response to the way people receive very famous artists, like, for example, Frida. I mean, it shouldn't go unsaid that the artists that I would name right now are also women, and that's part of why what they had to say was not taken seriously. But, Frida Kahlo and Georgia O'Keeffe, very different artists, they had a lot to say about their work. And literally none of it is ever reflected in what people say about them. I mean, Frida Kahlo's politics are wholly unpresent in her depiction in popular culture. And Georgia O'Keeffe, was adamant that these were pictures of flowers, and that's just like not even acknowledged. So I sort of, it was a moment of maybe frustration, almost even cynicism, to be honest with you. And, there's this other side of me where I have a lot to say, obviously. I'm kind of a chatterbox. But I also, and this is what led me into pottery, I've also, believe it or not, really always struggled to express myself. Like I've always felt that I have a lot of trouble getting out clearly all of the things that are in my mind. And it's easy for me to go on tangents, and then the topic, as you've probably discovered, the topic changes, and we're having a different conversation all of a sudden. And so this work was, in a way, attempt to reconcile all of that.
Well, I wanted to wrap up our talk thinking about the Hudson Valley Pottery Tour, which is coming up really soon. But also just thinking about tours in general, because I know that you've also organized events in the city. I think this last year, was it Pots? Is that what it's called?
You got it. Pots. Yes.
So can you talk about what you, as the person participating, want to get out of the tour or the event?
Yes, that's such a great point. And I remember I listened to your episode with Lucy Fagala, who was one of the founders of the Asparagus Valley. And, you made the comment in that episode that, often it's the case that at the beginning of it, it's a lot of work, maybe it's a lot of fun, but the sales aren't always the best. And then they grow, and then it becomes these amazing things that we all know about. And so I'm so fortunate that I was invited to be one of the very first people at the Hudson Valley Pottery Tour. It was like the thing when I try and explain to my, friends who aren't ceramists, or to my students when I talk about this event, it was like, Jimmy Page called me up and said, "Hey, let's go on the road with Led Zeppelin." I was like, "Oh my God, I'm there." And, my connection to Doug at the time was that I had taken a workshop with him, and, we had a good rapport. And so when he was setting this tour up, he was looking for people that were local and whose work he liked, and I guess I fit the bill. And that very first year of the Hudson Valley Pottery Tour was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work. And, there were a lot of people from the Hudson Valley community that weren't necessarily ceramists that came out. Like, Doug took out ads like in not the penny saver, but like in local newspapers, like grocery stores and stuff like that. He put up all these little political signs, like really doing like amazing grassroots marketing. And, there were people who came that year that like arrived and they just had this look on their face, like, where am I? Like this guy, I'm at this guy's house and he's selling cups for $75 and like, this is what he does. And like, all these people are interested in it. And there were people who like asked like very earnest, sincere questions and maybe didn't buy anything that year. And you know what? Those people then came back. They came back the year after that and so on. And then they become really good customers and now they're ceramic collectors. And I think that's exactly what you should be hoping to get out of a pottery tour, is building relationships with your actual existing community. People in your neighborhood, in your community, who maybe, you might have even seen at the grocery store, but you never talked to, and telling them, or not telling them, sharing this amazing universe that we're part of, this world that is like so special in this community, and sort of bringing people into that. And I think that's the real success of it. So, I'm so lucky in that Doug has continued to invite me back. This will be the 7th annual Hudson Valley Pottery Tour that I'm a part of, and I've gotten to become close friends with his family, his whole extended family and his children, and also the other potters on the tour. And so, if your listeners aren't familiar, it's October 21st and 22nd. It's always the third weekend in October. And, Doug really, I think, was inspired by things like, the Asparagus Valley Pottery Tour, obviously St. Croix. And there are altogether, I think, I'm so bad at mental math, there are 5 host artists who are all, ranging the spectrum from functional pottery to fine art and sort of in between. So those are a fellow Greenwich House Pottery faculty member, international ceramic superstar, Kathy Erdeman. So she'll open up her studio, and I'm so excited. She's like built a new studio, so I'm going to see that for the first time. Anat Shifton, who ran the ceramics department at New Paltz, and New Paltz is a big player in the community of who supports and who comes out to Hudson Valley Pottery Tour. My friend Lily Zuckerman, I think, is teaching a New Paltz right now, and she told me it's on the calendar. We are going, as a class. So that's a huge part of it. And then Jeff Shapiro, of course, is a sort of legendary figure in ceramics, but also the community. And another New Paltz faculty, Brian Seabez, sort of representing the 21st century direction of ceramics in a way. So it's so amazing, and it's such an awesome thing to be a part of. And that, that was my inspiration for starting my, it's not a pottery tour, but it is a modeled after that in a very singular way. There are pottery tours in New York City, but I actually don't live in close proximity to any of them. I don't live in Brooklyn. So, I've been in things called like the Brooklyn Pottery Invitational, but I'm not from Brooklyn. And I can't really be a part of the Brooklyn Ceramics Crawl. So I wanted to develop something that would reach those goals of engaging with the community. I think someone who's like a huge hero to me in the field is the late John Glick. And, his essay, I think it's paywalled now, but if you guys don't have a subscription to Studio Potter, do it. Pottery is Humanism, I think it was called. So, really so much of the tour, of course, sales are important. We need to sell our work. I love selling work. I love being able to continue making work because we sell it. And but really, it's about bringing together artists that I respect, both as ceramists and as people, because I want to have this community event where a lot of it is us speaking to New Yorkers, bringing our audiences together and talking about, well, what are the qualities that we're all going after here? And so we had our event, it was called Pots, last spring. And of course, Doug was the first person I invited. I was so happy to be able to have him be a part of it. And he was really such a big part of it. And it's always great, just so much fun hanging out with him. Such a good he also had such great advice for the whole thing, which is really, I benefited greatly from. And then my good friend, Kyle Scott Lee, who is a sort of like, maybe the most beloved New York City ceramics figure. Everybody loves Kyle. He's just such a sweet guy. And then also my friend Morgan Levine, who is actually another amazing there's not that many of us making this stuff, but she is an amazing slipware, marble slip artist out of Brooklyn. And we had some really great chats with people. As you can imagine, online sales are great. But connecting with people, hearing people's perspectives, seeing the way people just even pick up your pots is like, we don't have research and development teams. Like, that's my R&D time. Like, I'm taking mental notes the whole time. And the whole thing really, just to end on your question, what am I hoping to get out of these things? Well, one of my New Year's resolutions for 2023 was to commit to engaging with the community. I've gotten so much from the ceramics community, and I at times have tried to be a voice and then kind of gotten freaked out and scared and kind of run away from that responsibility or that role. And, I think like what you're doing with your podcast, like we have an obligation to represent the best parts of this community and engage with parts of the community that people would otherwise not be familiar with. So those are my goals.
To wrap up, can you leave your social media so people can get in touch if they want to talk about any of this?
You can find me on Instagram at Haakon Lenzi, HaakonLenzi. It's probably in the show notes. I'm also www.haakonlenzi.com. And the best way to stay in touch with me, honestly, would be to go to my website, and they'll ask you to join my mailing list. I don't send out a ton of emails. I send out maybe less than 12 in a year. And I have a lot of exciting stuff that I'm not ready to announce yet, but there's a lot of cool stuff coming down the pike. And I'd love to stay in touch with you. And you can also email me through there. And if you're on Facebook, I don't use it that much, but Haakon Lenzi Ceramics on Facebook as well. And my early New Year's resolution for 2024 is to get on TikTok. Man, the idea of another social media is like a little scary to me, but I know that's where it's happening, and video and all that. That's where things are going. So connect with me. If anyone is listening to this that follows me on Instagram, I love to talk to people on Instagram. I made so many amazing friends there. Feel free to write me a note, especially if you heard about me through this podcast, or if you followed me. I just always love to hear from people. I like talking.
Well, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. So grateful. Thank you so much for having me on. What an honor.
I'd like to thank Haakon for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat, and I want to wish him well for this week's Hudson Valley Pottery Tour. That's happening this weekend, October the 21st and 22nd. Haakon will be at Doug Peltzman's studio, but there's actually a bunch of other studios on the tour, including Kathy Erdeman, Tim Rowan, Anat Shifton, Brian Sebez, and Jeff Shapiro. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to HudsonValleyPotteryTour.com. Before we go, I wanted to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch through our website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week for another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, Or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.